asked me, I could write a book about the way you walk and talk and whisper and look.
Many singular sensations. If New York was my Oz, then Joe Papp's Public Theater was the Emerald City. I started in props and quickly rose to stage manager. There would be a list of the available stage managers, and when one got a show, the next in line would move to the top. Very fair and egalitarian. One of my luckiest assignments was a show called More Than You Deserve, a raucous satirical rock musical take on South Pacific, set in Vietnam, while the war was still going on. Nellie Forbush became a plucky reporter for the Village Voice, who falls in love with the base commander, Major Dillon, as she attempts to do an expose on the war and its atrocities, and to combat her newly acquired nymphomania brought on by singing and dancing soldiers. The book was by Michael Weller, with music and lyrics by a new kid on the theatrical block named Jim Steinman. Jim and I bonded during pre-production over shared interests, including film composer Bernard Herrmann and Bruce Springsteen. On breaks, we would go to a rehearsal room and he would play me material from other shows he was creating, including an audacious X-rated retelling of Peter Pan called The Lost Boys. One of my favorite duties was to read with the auditioners for the major parts. One young man made an instant impression trying out for the part of Melvin, the leading infantry role. He was handsome and quiet, but he lit up with electrifying energy when he began to read. Everyone knew he had the part, it was his for the taking. He said that he'd had a callback for a new sitcom in LA. The production team knew those things never worked out, and that he'd be back in time for rehearsals. The actor's name was Henry Winkler. The sitcom was Happy Days. He did not get back in time for rehearsals. Fred Gwynne, the beloved Herman Munster, came in to read for the major, the romantic lead. He towered over everyone in the room as he walked to the center of the stage and sat opposite me. He was so outlandishly funny and so hilariously sincere that I had a hard time reading lines with him because I kept laughing. His singing voice was charming, and he got the romantic lead. A heavy-set, disheveled young man auditioned for another of the soldiers. He was dressed in ripped jeans, a loose t-shirt, and carried a red handkerchief with which he was constantly wiping his sweaty brow. His shoulder-length hair was stringy and shiny, like he had just finished a tough game of racquetball. He told those assembled in a lazy southern drawl that his name was Marvin Lee Aday, but that he preferred to be called Meatloaf, since he had just recorded a duo album with his girlfriend called Stoney and Meatloaf. He fit the character perfectly. He sang with a rock voice of operatic power, tearing the roof off the tiny rehearsal space and pocketing the part. Jim Steinman practically jumped out of his seat as Meatloaf finished. He shook his hand, and then the two of them huddled in a corner talking. When the show was reviewed, the venerable New York Times didn't know what to make of it. But in their review, they referred to the extraordinary voice of Mr. Loaf. A couple of years later, I sat next to Jim in the Meadowlands as he mouthed every word of Heaven Can Wait, the big ballad from More Than You Deserve, along with me singing on the stage in the debut concert of their album Bat Out of Hell. I was elected to be equity rep for the company. One of my duties was signing up each of the first-timers who were getting their equity cards. If someone had a name that was already taken, they would fill out a form to receive a stage name. One talented newbie was cast as a paraplegic whose intravenous bottle was spiked with LSD, resulting in a wild tap number. I said the Times didn't know what to make of it. Yes. He handed me the form on which he had printed "Just in Time." I looked at the paper. I looked at him. I looked at the paper. I looked at him again and shook my head. Are you sure you want to have this name for the rest of your career? Why don't you go over there and sit down and think about it while I process the next cast member? He came back later and handed me the sheet with a smile on his face. I looked down and it read, "Just in case." I slowly shook my head again. After a few more tries, we settled on a more reasonable name, which I will withhold to protect the guilty. One night, the flu hit the production. There were more people out sick than there were understudies to cover them. The director and choreographer restaged every number except the climactic Dream Ballet, in which the entire cast, dressed in white military garb, danced and sang in the Major and Nellie's dream wedding. In this scene, the dancers would line up in geometrical patterns, so a missing body would be glaringly apparent. I had been at all the rehearsals for the show, including those for the understudies. I knew and loved the score, and I fit into the missing dancer's costume. So I was drafted, no pun intended, and I must say I looked dashing in my dress whites. I spent time immediately before the show started and at intermission going over steps with some of the other soldiers. The choreography was fairly simple, but it was nerve-wracking nonetheless. Right before the number, I was standing off stage next to Fred, waiting to enter. He asked how I was doing and if I was nervous. I answered, okay and yes. He said there was nothing to worry about, everyone was rooting for me, and I'd be great. Just as I was about to go on, he whispered, make sure you don't laugh because it will wreck the number. I thought this was an odd thing for him to say, but I gave it no further thought as my nerves kicked back in and I went out under the lights and performed the first steps without mishap, even managing to sing in harmony with the rest of the company. I looked up at Fred, whose back was to the audience, and he began to make the most ridiculous faces with that rubbery Munster mug of his, going so far as to stretch out his lips and stick his tongue out and wiggle it around. He was trying to get me to lose it. Another bit of choreography began, and I maneuvered around the stage in unison with the rest, only to find myself once again looking directly at Fred, and he again making crazy faces with his back to the audience. This happened one more time in the number, and then we faced front and sang out the final lines of the song. The lights blacked out, and I quickly exited to get back to stage managing, my crisp white costume now drenched with sweat. When I saw Fred after the show, he patted me on the back and said, good job. I thought for sure I was going to get you to at least giggle. I guess I'm losing my touch. I didn't tell him that I had been so petrified that I wouldn't have laughed if he'd reached out and tickled me.
I discovered as my book ends how to make two